The US is using a new doctrine to shift global power dynamics and test long-standing rules of engagement. The Donroe Doctrine, a modern reinterpretation of US foreign policy, places greater emphasis on national interest, enforcement power, and regional dominance. This week on the program, we unpack the Donroe Doctrine and what it means for Africa, the UN, and multilateralism. I'm Penina Karibe. Welcome to Talk Africa. The idea behind the so-called Donroe Doctrine is not new. It traces its roots back more than 200 years to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. At the time, US President James Monroe warned European powers against interfering in the Americas, arguing that the Western Hemisphere should be free from external control. In return, the United States pledged not to interfere in European affairs. In 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt expanded this approach through what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary, stating that the United States would intervene militarily in Latin America to maintain stability and protect U.S. interests. Fast forward to today, under President Donald Trump, the United States has revived these ideas for the 21st century, a shift now commonly referred to as the Donroe Doctrine. Under this approach, the U.S. places renewed emphasis on regional dominance, unilateral action, and limiting the influence of rival powers, even if that means bypassing multilateral institutions or international norms. The doctrine has generated significant discussion and controversy regarding its implications for international law, sovereignty, and global stability. To unpack what this means for Africa and the global system, I'm now joined by our panel of experts. Joining us from Cairo is Ambassador Motaz Ahmadine Khalil. He's a former Egyptian permanent representative to the United Nations. In Beijing, via Zoom, we have Mr. Aina Tangen, Fellow, Center for International Governance Innovation, CIGI. And from Jackson in California, we also have via Zoom Dr. James Armstead, retired professor at the U.S. Naval War College. A very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us for this discussion. Dr. Armstead, I'll begin with you. In which ways does the Donroe Doctrine align with or differ from contemporary U.S. foreign policy?
First, the policy you're referring to, the Duncan policy, this is really the Monroe Doctrine, rewritten, if you will, or written for a more modern sense by the Trump administration. The Western Hemisphere was undergoing a period of revolution. Countries were breaking away from Portugal, breaking away from Spain, and of course the United States had broken away 50 years earlier, 48 years earlier from the United Kingdom. The view of the United States as the predominant power in the hemisphere was that no further interference from colonial powers should be made with these colonies, former colonies, in the new hemisphere, in the Western Hemisphere. The Trump version of that, and it's enunciated fairly well in the national security document, which has been out now for several months. The new national security doctrine essentially recognizes American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, which is a restatement, if you will, of the Monroe Doctrine. It also recognizes a focus on economic interests of the United States, and it certainly recognizes hegemony or certainly the aggrandizement of China and Russia in their respective spheres of influence. So this is an attempt in many ways to go back to the period of the great powers, the, if you will, from Chancellor Bismarck, realpolitik. If you have the power in the area, then you are the senior nation state. You can do what it is that you want, and other people will be in concert therewith. I think that gives you a short view, at least, of what I see as the Donroe Doctrine is at this point.
Mr. Tangen, one of the goals of the Donroe Doctrine has so far been visible in Venezuela. What message does that send beyond Latin America, and why should Africa care about a doctrine focused on the Americas?
Donald Trump's idea is quite different. He says that the U.S. has complete domination over the entire Northern Hemisphere. And that is quite different. And you can't just push that aside as some sort of subtlety. He's doing away with international law. And yes, he's going to realpolitik. But realpolitik, in this instance, represents the law of the jungle. It repudiates everything that the United States did post-World War II in setting up institutions that were supposed to protect against these very kinds of predations. So right now, why is Venezuela, of course, they were illegally ordered their president taken away. And that's a big thing. And why would Africa care or the rest of the world? It's because the United States has declared war on civilization. They're going to take anything that they can, including Greenland, by force if necessary, according to Donald Trump. They've had their eye on others. In terms of what that means for all of the countries of the world, it means you should be afraid. There are no stops. And if you think for one instant that if Donald Trump or his ilk were to gain control of the Western Hemisphere, that they would stop there, you're wrong. You know, that old saying goes, they came for my neighbor, I said nothing. They came for my friend, I said nothing. They came for me, and there was no one to say anything. And this is exactly what the world needs to stand up to. The only way you can stand up to a bully who does not respect the law is to have the countries come together in an overwhelming force, not to create another organization, a new UN. They could kick the US out, I could understand that. But they should come together and just simply say to Donald Trump, what you do with your people, if you want to put tariffs on them, that is fine. That is between you and your voters. But you will not put the rest of the world into some sort of sick colonial game where you pit us against each other for your favor. That is not the way it should work. And it's not human. It is not a way that's productive. It's not sustainable.
Okay, so Ambassador Khalil, let's bring you in and let's say this doctrine signals a return to spheres of influence. What does that actually mean? And what does that shift mean for Africa?
Well, I think that Africa is not on the top list of priorities of the American new strategy. It has only 3 paragraphs at the very end of its 30-something pages document, compared to the Western Hemisphere, which has 20-something paragraphs, or Western Europe, or even the Middle East, or India and Pacific, which does not augur well for Africa. The focus of the United States is into tapping the resources of Africa, especially energy resources and critical material supplies, and opening the markets of Africa. This and forgetting about any pretense of democracy or human rights promotion. In my opinion, this does not augur well for Africa, and it reflects that the new priorities of the United States is a transactionalist, mercantilist policy. So maybe, because it is not in the first range of priorities of the United States, Africa is lucky enough that it might be spared from any military intervention in the foreseeable future.
Well, Dr. Armstead, when we look at all that is happening here, does this create an either-or dilemma for African states, forcing them to choose between economic partnership and security alliances, especially considering the fact that the U.S. remains dominant in security cooperation?
American foreign policy has been more or less the same, despite the administrational changes since the 1880s. Our interests were open and free trade, support democracies, and keep the sea lanes open. Those have been the basic tenets of American foreign policy since the 1880s. Now, there have been different focuses and thrusts and small changes along the way, but those are the 3 basic directions that American policy has gone in. Now, I think what you see with the new Trump national security doctrine are the political relationships, as the ambassador stated, are going to be principally based on economic relationships, not the other way around. In the past, that's been quite different. So we are seeing now, I think, a change in the way the rest of the world is viewed. As Mr. Chairman said, there's a interest in dominance in the Western Hemisphere, but in the rest of the world, there is a relaxing of our integration and our responsibilities. In fact, last week, the United States withdrew from 66 world organizations, which is absolutely terrible. Obviously, the invasion of any place is an act of war. That the basis of the international law is sovereignty, the protection of national security, starting with the initial protection and the sanctity of the political boundaries of a state, the territory of a state. And there are only two exceptions to this. That one can go to war if there is an attack. You have a right to self-defense, Article 51. And of course, if the UN there's a resolution from the Security Council for a forceful intervention based on some violation of international law. Other than that, we don't have an exception to territorial integrity. It's absolutely protected. If you don't see the world in terms of great power politics, you don't have a traditional position to play in that world from the Trump point of view, and that's very dangerous. We are going from a position of, in my view at least, of a world order, however poorly it was conducted, but we had an order, we had a set of rules. Most nations respected that. We're going to a position of utter chaos, and the African nations that are developing and are feeling their way around changes of relationships with other states and other places are going to have to look now at this chaos and try to determine where it is they want to go, who they think they can work with, and who can be trusted. That's going to be a difficult question.
Okay. Mr. Tangen, I want to get your thoughts on that. For Africa feeling it's got to choose this way or the other.
What we have is the U.S. trying to frame the world that it's either Russia, China, or the U.S. But China has not been pushing hegemony. Yes, they push trade. It's necessary. They have to import raw materials. They're very poor, about 100 in terms of raw materials per person. In terms of countries around the world, it's about the halfway mark. And then they like to add value to them and sell them. But in order to do that, they are looking at a situation where it is not a zero-sum game, but one in which the pie can be made bigger. How do you do that? Well, you downstream industries, especially labor-intensive ones, to other countries. You co-develop technology so that they're not going to be a have and have not, especially as we get into the digital world. So they have a different view. It's based on their civilization, which has seen empires come and go, and they decided that the only sustainable way of doing things is not to have hegemony, but to have cooperation. To have a global governance initiative which respects the sovereignty that my dear colleague has pointed to and that we need. You know, the problem here is simply the United States. I'm a U.S. citizen. I don't say that lightly. But, you know, as my colleague said, you know, the idea of America was to open the sea lanes, protect itself, and et cetera. But how does that apply to Mexico and Canada? There are no sea lanes there. These are neighbors, and yet we are beating on them as if they were our worst enemy. So yes, Africa should choose, and it should choose to be with other countries. It should be part of something called BRICS. It should be looking for solutions not to be given to them by former colonial masters, but like at COP30, when it became clear that neither Europe or America was willing to do anything substantive for the third world. It is time, if you want a better world, for countries to come together and make one. Okay. You cannot wait for others to do it.
All right. So Ambassador Khalil, let me come to you. Africa holds around 30% of global mineral reserves and accounts for about 70% of global cobalt production, a resource central to energy transition and new technologies. So in the face of these global shifts, how can African countries use this resource advantage as leverage rather than becoming an arena for external pressure?
Well, in my opinion, African countries, it is about time to bond together and invest inside Africa and try to be interdependent before looking abroad. This will be in contradiction of the old colonial politics and the emerging new colonialism that is reflected by the actions of the United States. And here, if I can get back very quickly to this collapse of the international order as we knew it, in my opinion, I see that the United States, which was the dominant power of the old order, is in decline. And it is aware that it is in decline, and this is why it is picking up fights with the weaker parts of the current order in order to prove its power and prevent potential rivals like China and Russia from pushing through in order to accelerate the demise of the United Nations. And the United States is very careful to antagonize China and Russia, but they are picking up the fights with the weaker parts only, because if it picks a fight with Russia or China, it will get injured or humiliated. And this will be counter to the objective of projecting power and invincibility. This is, of course, a dilemma in which the African governments should, in addition to work with institutions of the African Union and with each other to achieve interdependence between African countries, maybe they could look for good, balanced as possible or equilibrated deals with the United States and other partners, if, of course, including potential rivals of the United States like China or Europe, which has a strong footing in Africa, in order to balance the effects of this administration, waiting it out or waiting for this transitional order in which we are in right now after the collapse of the rules-based order, waiting for reshaping of the international order in a more sustainable manner than the ways it is right now.
And on that note, let's take a short break. When we return, we will look at how Africa is navigating these global shifts and what option the continent has going forward. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with our discussion. Still with me is Ambassador Mutaz Ahmadin Khalil, Mr. Einar Tangen, and Dr. James Armstead. Now, Ambassador Khalil, let's begin this part with you. The UN Charter is built on principles like sovereignty, non-interference, and collective security, while the Donroe Doctrine appears to prioritize national interest and enforcement power over collective roles. What does this shift mean for international law and the authority of the UN Charter?
This is the collapse of international law and the collapse of the rules-based order from the part of the United States. In the rules-based order, every country, even if it did not respect international law, would pretend that it would respect international law, the principles of human rights and democracy, and accuse the others of ignoring them. But now, as we have read in the recent interview of President Trump with the New York Times, he said that he does not care about international law, and the only limit to his absolute power is his own morality. And here I do not think that we can count on that. This is very dangerous for the international system, very dangerous for Africa. I think that Africa is the continent that has more violent crises. We have a crisis in Sudan, we have insurrection in Libya, we have problems of terrorism in West Africa, in Nigeria, in the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia. Why? Because until now, the American companies have not focused on investing in Africa, and they do not care as much about the stability of Africa. And again, there is a threat to the internationally recognized border. As we have seen, Somaliland has been recognized by Israel, who tried to entice the United States to recognize Somaliland, but thank God the mood of President Trump that day was not within the idea of recognizing Somaliland, but they are not doing enough effort to stabilize the problems. In Sudan even, yes, they condemned the actions of the rapid support forces, but they have not by any means tried to prevent their actions. They are treating them at the same level of the way they are treating the government, which again is not leading to optimism regarding how to settle the conflict in Sudan.
Mr. Tangen, when those principles are seen to be broken in practice, what are the consequences and who actually enforces accountability?
Well, Panina, this is the problem with international law. Countries are sovereign. They can only live peacefully with each other if they have a consensus. And that was what was internationally recognized. That's why we have the UN and all of the entities that were part of that. There is no real ability to go in and declare war. Yes, there are exceptions where they can say, well, for these reasons, we are going, the UN is going to take an armed stance. But those are very, very slim things like genocide, etc. But the idea that you would have one big body declaring war on other countries is not really palatable. It goes against this idea of sovereign nations. Nations are supposed to be able to decide their own fate. Not, their rules and laws should not be written in the capital of another country. So there's very little that can be done except find solutions. And I pointed to one before where you have a collective body march down to the White House or just say internationally we have come together. In the US, you have to knock it off. But apart from that, there has to be more. And there are three things that I think people should be considering. One, I don't believe that the market is going to solve this, or that, we have lots of differences. We'll just come together and figure them out. These have been age old. What you need are new drivers, and some of them have to be economic. And by that, I mean, there are two very important ones. One, Africa's ability, its resources should not be a curse. It should work with other countries in the global south who have similar minerals and form bourses, much like OPEC did with oil. If there are 4 countries that export 70% of all the coffee in the world, guess what? There are 4 companies that control the coffee trade. They're all based in the United States and in Europe. They don't grow beans, they simply exploit them, and they make tons more money than the poor farmers who get very, very little. So if they come together and they decide to have a bourse, they can reverse the flow of wealth that has been traveling its way to its former colonial masters and equalize it. They can then set aside money for development and to deal with climate change, as well as making sure that their farmers are paid a living wage and are rewarded for their efforts that start at the very beginning. The second is small and medium-sized enterprises. Africa doesn't have large, big companies that can go toe-to-toe with American and Chinese and Russian behemoths. They have small ones. So with the digital tools that are now available, small companies, medium-sized companies can advertise in markets across the world, find clients through social media. Then through the logistics system that has been set up since the Belt and Road Initiative was put in place, started being put in place 12 years ago, they can get it logistically to wherever it needs to go and efficiently and cheaply. And lastly, there are now digital payment platforms which allow them to actually get paid. This is business, small businesses, medium-sized business, the kind of businesses that Africa has. So these are things that can be done. These are the solutions, but they're not going to be brought to Africa by saviors from the colonial world, whether it's the United States with its financial colonialism or Europe with its physical colonialism. This is something Africa and other global South countries have to do for themselves.
Okay, so as we come to the end of the show, my final question will be to all three of you. And in the interest of time, I request that we keep it brief. Now, how will Donroe Doctrine change the way countries deal with the United States? I mean, what should Africa's strategic response be to this changing global order? And Dr. Armstead, we'll begin with you.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't rely too much on this Donroe Doctrine. I don't think this is going to last. This is not the focus of the entire country. This is one particular party. It's a minority party that happens to be in power right now. And in a year, we will have midterm elections. I think there's going to be a sea change in what Trump has announced. Remember, he did not run on the things that we're seeing in this current national security document. The recognition that we are, you will remember my earlier comment that we live in an interdependent world. America is trying to pull back with this Donroe Doctrine, if you will. It's trying to pull back from this interdependence, working with the rest of the world. It's not going to be successful for us, and I don't think it's going to continue because this is not what the people in the country want, and we're seeing that already.
Ambassador Khalil, what are your thoughts?
Well, in my opinion, I agree totally with the professor that the Donroe Doctrine is not sustainable, but I would like just to add here that Africa, there is a missing element from what the two professors have said, and I totally agree with from the economic perspective, but the political perspective is extremely important. Africa should strengthen the legitimacy of African governments. There should be political reform, combating corruption, in order to build a strong base inside to make it immune from interference or intervention from abroad. Because if we look at Venezuela, for example, or Iran, they have serious problems of legitimacy. So Africa should focus, in addition to economic growth and prosperity, to the political framework in order to strengthen legitimacy and strengthen the institutions within Africa, to make them more pliable to interdependence and cooperation with the region, and more immune from foreign intervention and wars and instability. And
Mr. Tangen, what are your perspectives?
Well, I'm going to respectfully disagree slightly with the ambassador. Canada and Mexico, Greenland, they are all legitimate. They're all democratic, and yet their legitimacy is being questioned by the United States. So I don't think it'll protect you. But I do agree that Africa has to do something about its corruption. But my take is different. I go back to the solutions I suggested. You look at the Sahels. What have they done? They kicked out the French because they were buying yellow cake for 20 cents euro a pound and reselling it for 200 euros a pound. They were ripping off these countries. This country said, enough. We are going to do this ourselves. I think that is what Africa needs. But they need to be able to pay for it internally. And that means getting fair value for their resources, developing the small, medium-sized enterprises, and creating the kind of financial institutions that can allow them to go forward and develop their communities, states, nations, as they see fit, not as dictated to.
Oh, thank you very much for that. And that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A very big thank you to our guests, Ambassador Mutaz Ahmadine Khalil, former Egyptian permanent representative to the United Nations, Mr. Einar Tangen, Fellow, Center for International Governance Innovation, and Dr. James Armstead, retired professor at the U.S. Naval War College. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X. And you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more of Talk Africa. From me, Penina Karibe, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, it's goodbye.